Well, hello and welcome to History Valley Podcast. This evening we are having a debate night. Did Jesus exist? Tonight we will have Adair and John Gleason versus Jacob Berman and Dennis MacDonald. Jacob Berman and Dennis MacDonald will be taking the affirmative. Adair and John Gleason will be taking the negative on did Jesus exist. The format is going to be pretty basic, as we normally do, where we'll have two 15-minute intros. We're going to have 4 rounds of 10 minutes each. Then the 5th round is going to be like a back and forth impromptu, if you will, for about 30 minutes or so. Welcome, everybody, to debate night or debate evening on History Valley Podcast. John and Dennis, Jacob and Aaron, welcome. So since, let me see, it's Jacob and Dennis will take the affirmative. So we're going to start with Dr. Adair and John Gleason. They're taking the negative with their 15-minute intro to get things started. Gentlemen, we can just kind of jump right in. I'm going to get my timer ready. I'll give you a warning, 5 minutes maybe to a minute, if that's okay with everybody.
If I can get a 5 and a 1 minute, that'd be good.
In a 1 minute, yeah, that sounds about right. I'm going to get my timer ready here. So without further ado, who's gonna give the opening arguments for the negative then?
John will start us, and I have my screen shared, and we'll be using that as our platform.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, I'll start the timer when you guys begin.
All right. So I'm just introducing our opening statement here for the debate. And first, I want to thank everybody for being here, Sean for moderating, and Jacob and Dennis for engaging in this discussion with us. But today, both Aaron and I are going to present our arguments for why we think that Jesus probably didn't exist. Next slide. First, I want to heavily emphasize that I'm not a scholar. Dr. Adair does have more degrees than I do. But as far as I go, I am not a scholar in this area today. But our positions are supported by relevant experts in the field of history and New Testament studies. Currently, the full peer-reviewed hypothesis is described in Richard Carrier's On the Historicity of Jesus, and Raphael Lataster's Questioning the Historicity of Jesus establishes a good foundation for remaining agnostic on the topic and responding to the best historical defenses that currently exist. He does a deep dive on both Dr. Bart Ehrman's Did Jesus Exist? And Maurice Casey's attempt to prove that Jesus existed. Both works contain extensive footnotes and citations establishing that they are consulting the full range of academic sources to establish their positions, and I highly recommend either book. Next. What is mythicism? So first, what exactly is mythicism? Mythicism is a historical hypothesis concerning the existence of Jesus Christ. Historical hypotheses are usually judged on the basis of how likely something did exist or occur. That's why I'm specific when I describe my conclusion. I usually say that Jesus probably didn't exist because it is a likelihood calculation. Minimal mythicism stipulates that he was originally a celestial figure that was given a body constructed by God using David's seed. He subsequently descended from the upper heavens to the lower heavens in the firmament just above the earth. While there, he was killed, buried, and resurrected. He then ascended back up to the upper levels of heaven. Later, he appeared to people on earth, proclaiming his sacrifice and offering eternal salvation from their sins. There is a lot of evidential support for this hypothesis, and given the context of Christianity, it is the best explanation for the weird evidence we find in sources like Paul, which means it seems to be the most parsimonious explanation for what we find in early Christianity. And then we have some areas to go over. We're going to be talking about the background information surrounding Christianity, the Pauline evidence, and then finally any extra biblical references to him that exist. And I believe now we're switching over to Dr. Adair's slides.
All right, so trying to flesh out what we are proposing as our model. So a bit of background information. First off, that we see just from Judaism, even before Christianity, there's this notion of a heavenly man, sometimes also called the Son of Man, in our various sources. It goes back at least to the book of Daniel, but this heavenly man figure we see also showing up in First Enoch, in the apocalyptic literature like Fourth Ezra, the Sibylline Oracles, and even the Apostle Paul seems to suggest that Jesus was some sort of angelic being, as suggested in one point in Galatians. Now, usually the sticking point will be this heavenly being couldn't possibly have been killed, but there are signs that this is something that was actively believed in Judaism. Again, in Daniel 9, it explicitly says that this messianic figure there will be killed, that he'll be cut off. And in the apocalyptic literature, such as in Fourth Ezra, it says that this Davidic heavenly Messiah will also be killed. One could also see how it could be extracted from Scripture. So, for example, in Zechariah 12:10, there is this unusual thing in the Hebrew there that gets also seen in translations into Greek, that the speaker, who is God in this case, says that that is the figure that is pierced, and then there will be mourning for the one who is pierced. So God saying, I'm going to be pierced. There seems to probably be some typo that happened early on the Hebrew, but that's what's being read there, and also being read in the book of Revelation and in the Gospel of John as proclaiming the proof text for why Jesus was killed. It's also worth noting this same text is used later in the both versions of the Talmud, saying that this killed figure here is actually referring to the Messiah ben Joseph. So a dying Messiah, son of Joseph. If you think you've heard of that before, that's because you've been paying attention to your Bible. The figure, this heavenly figure as well, we also see showing up in the works of Philo. Philo is a Jewish writer, basically contemporaneous with like the earliest days of Christianity and before, and he talks about a figure that is the Word of God, or the Logos. Sounds very similar to John, but also is the firstborn of God, the ruler of the angels, the image of God, the creator of the world through which the whole world was created, master of the universe, and not in the He-Man sense, like in the actual like rules the world as it is. And also as the heavenly high priest. These are all things that we can find in the earliest Christian literature, including the authentic Pauline literature. So the correspondence between Philo's idea of this super angel, this heavenly being, and what early Christians believe in is extremely similar and interesting. That needs explanation. It's also worth noting when I say that this person is from a heavenly place, that like a heavenly temple that they work in, heaven is a little bit different than what we understand. In their system, that there are basically multiple levels of heaven. We see this, for example, in the Apocalypse of Moses, that puts the Garden of Eden, that puts paradise in third heaven, where Adam is buried. The Apostle Paul seems to think the same thing, because he also says paradise is in the third heaven, according to his own road trip up to the heavens. The idea that the heavens is basically the place of the dead and the souls is something that we find both in the Greco-Roman world and in Jewish and Christian literature. I just have a whole bunch of different examples here of saying that on the far side of the moon is where Elysium is, that basically you do get your wings and fly about the cosmos when you are a good soul and you can go up that high. We also see some interesting things, such as in the Sibylline Oracles and in Revelation, that basically at that lowest levels of the heavens, that it's also filled with demons that are fighting each other. You get the original Star Wars there. You literally have the stars fighting each other. And this idea also shows up the Ascension of Isaiah, that talks about demons fighting each other in the firmament, and the firmament is filled with the same kind of stuff we have here on Earth. So in other words, stuff can happen in the firmament with the same kinds of things that we see here on Earth. And I have some recent discussion down here, including from Robin Faith Walsh, that actually was published like the last day of 2024. So we're talking cutting edge scholarship here. Now, what can we extract from the earliest Christians? We can usually pull this from the letters of Paul. He's our earliest witness to so much of this, especially the things that are considered to be these pre-Pauline hymns, such as from Philippians, 1 Corinthians, and Romans. The earliest belief that we can find in there is that Jesus was some sort of Messiah, somehow Davidic, and resurrected from the dead. Those are, some big things. But also that not just some person who was killed, but somehow is some sort of angelic being that is pre-existent. We see that in the earliest literature, especially like in Philippians. We don't find things that we would say, here is the life and ministry of this figure. We just basically find the super, extra galactic Jesus doing things. Oh, it's later that we start seeing that in other documents afterwards. It's also worth noting that we can find some signs that the way that the heavenly Messiah is going to come into the world is not the normal, natural way. I have these various sources here in Syriac because that's usually the earliest form that we can find some of them in, and it uses this word for the astronomical rising of a star to reference the birth of this messianic figure. It seems to derive ultimately from Numbers 24:17, but it's also used in 4th Ezra to talk about how somehow this heavenly being will arise from David, using the same term. Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews also does this, where Jesus is supposed to be like Melchizedek, who has no father or mother. That's a little bit interesting. And this Messiah will also rise from the tribe of Judah. Say, again, Davidic lineage, using the same terminology. Similarly, in the Odes of Solomon, the Messiah is supposed to be from another race than who saw them. In other words, if this is supposed to be a human, then he's not like any other human. That's already kind of weird. And also, again, using the same term in Syriac to talk about the light of the world will arise, using this astronomical language for the birth of someone or the resurrection of someone. This is not the normal language you use for people and the reproduction of people. Now, the big thing is Jesus is supposed to be heavenly and then comes down to suffer. We see this most explicitly in the Philippians hymn that he descends from heaven. This also shows up in the Ascension of Isaiah in the visionary portion of it. And it's also from there in particular, we see the idea that Jesus is killed by demonic forces in heaven. This has been contentious in some previous discussions, so I'm laying out like some of the texts here directly from the Ascension that says that the angel of death lives and does all of his activities, all his fighting in the firmament, that Jesus is explicitly supposed to descend into the firmament to be killed by the angel there, and explicitly in verse 10:14 that afterwards from the angel of death he will arise. So literally from where the angel of death is, that's where the resurrection takes place. So this is happening in a heavenly locale, and then the description of that descent to the firmament is given. The hints also exist in Revelation and in 1 Corinthians that the source of the killing of Jesus is also demonic rather than human. I will be talking about that later.
5 minutes.
Most importantly, though, thank you. Most importantly, then the figure resurrects and returns to heaven in a transformed version. We see this again in the Philippians hymn, some of our oldest literature in Christianity, as well as the Ascension of Isaiah and the star hymn that appears in the letter of Ignatius. Mind you, we don't have earthly stories in our earliest sources. This seems to be an early version of what Christians believed. So where did the stories of Jesus actually come from? So from Paul, we learn that apparently the source for knowing about Jesus is revelation and scriptural exegesis. These are things he's explicit about multiple times in his letters. And also the idea what those revelations could look like is based on perhaps his own heavenly trips, his own trip to the third heaven that is described in 2 Corinthians 12. So if this is where the early beliefs about Jesus come from, how do they transport to here on earth? The idea that we are proposing is the idea of euhemerization. This was an active sort of thing done in antiquity, where you take a god and you basically create a story of them as a more normal dude on earth doing things. Plutarch says this is particularly the case for the Isis and Osiris myth that are actually about demonic forces in the heavens, but the stories of Isis and Osiris being kings and queens in Egypt, that was actually the encoded version of that myth. The idea then is Christians take their revelatory things and that becomes history. Perhaps, for example, the Lord's Supper, as described in 1 Corinthians 11 as a vision, he says it's actually something revealed to Paul. This then becomes the Last Supper, as we see in the Jesus story. And so from there, the stories are formulated by using common literary tropes, techniques. I'm going to say Dennis's favorite word, mimesis, a whole lot of that happening in the creation of the Gospels. We see some of this also being kind of told to us in the 2nd century by Justin Martyr, who says that the Old Testament is filled with all sorts of symbols and parables that hide their true meaning about what's really going to be happening in the future. And ultimately, Jesus is supposed to be fulfilling all these prophecies. Now, how does he know about Jesus fulfilling these prophecies? Now, he does cite something called the Memoirs of the Apostles. The weird thing, though, is that in Justin's writing, he also says John of Patmos is an apostle and cites the book of Revelation as a source for stuff that Jesus is supposed to do. So for even Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, the way that you know about what Jesus did is revelatory and scriptural primarily. And it also looks like he will make up examples of what Jesus said and did based on his own exegesis. So for example, Jesus was born in a cave. Does he have a gospel that says that? It's not in any of our canonical gospels, and he explicitly tells us how he knows Jesus was born in a cave. It says so, quote unquote, in Isaiah 33. Also, sometimes Justin will just straight up contradict the gospels. So, for example, in the birth story of Jesus, it's supposed to be the Magi or the wise men who come from the east. This is explicit in Matthew. But Justin Martyr, what does he say? He says they come from Arabia, which is not east. And then he even says specifically from Damascus, and that these guys were held in bondage by demons. Does any of that happen in the story that you read or any of the nativity plays? Absolutely not. This is his own invention, and he also tells us again, he's extracting this from his own readings of Jeremiah and especially Isaiah 8. It's worth noting, Arabia and Damascus are not east of Palestine, not in the past and definitely not today. So what is Justin doing here? He is showing how these stories are developed. The way he knows what Jesus really did isn't because of eyewitness reports or things like that. It's his own way of saying, here's what the scripture says, and because I am the bestest boy ever who knows how to interpret this, this is what really happened. If people are doing this in the 2nd century and thinking that they can pass this off and convince people, then clearly this is something that could be plausible for the gospel writers that Justin also seems to at least rely on, since he will cite the quote-unquote memoirs of the apostles. It's also worth noting that Justin does not say these are writings of the disciples. Justin will distinguish between apostles and disciples, and he'll even say the memoirs of the apostles are created by the apostles and those who came later, as if it's some sort of like ongoing production of things. Like maybe there's more revelations like Justin's coming along. If this is how Christians are creating their stories, we can't use them to reliably know what the historical Jesus did, but it would be the sort of way of how a heavenly Jesus created out of exegesis became the more historical figure that we know. That is our opening, and I also want to repeat that I'm happy to be here. Jacob and I have done this a couple times before. Dennis, it's awesome to see you again, and if this weren't a debate, I'd just be spending the next 20 minutes effusing about how much I've loved your research.
Well, that was almost perfect because you're at 14 minutes and 50 seconds.
Oh, yeah.
So that was a really good introductory round. Jacob and Dennis, are you prepared and ready for your 15-minute intro?
I would say we are.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and get us going here. Yeah, so we're taking the affirmative position that Jesus did exist. I'm going to speak for a little bit, and then I'll let Dennis take over the rest of the introductory argument. So I agree with Berman that Jesus was probably an apocalyptic preacher. And I also think it would not necessarily conflict with the idea that Jesus was a rebel. And I may come back to that in a little bit, but I'm going somewhere with that. Paul states in Galatians that James is the Lord's brother. Now, Paul does not singularly focus on anyone else in his letters like this. He never says that anyone else is the Lord's brother. He just says James is the Lord's brother. In Romans, Paul states that Jesus descended from David according to the flesh. How can Jesus be a heavenly figure if he is understood to be the descendant of King David? In Romans 9:4-5, Paul says they are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs, and from them, according to the flesh, comes the Christ, who is over all. And in Galatians, he says, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent his son, born of a woman under the Torah, under the law. So if Jesus was entirely a heavenly figure, how is he under the law? I'll be citing from V. George Shillington, James and Paul, The Politics of Identity at the Turn of the Ages. He says, Paul can thus refer to the filial relationship of James with Jesus as brother of the Lord, and his readers will know who the Lord is. Neither would Paul consider instruction from James equal in authority to the Spirit of the Lord. Even so, Paul has to acknowledge that James of Jerusalem is a brother of Jesus, and that family relationship was bound to give James privileged status in the new Jesus movement. And the point that is being made here is, if this was a title that was thrown around to other people and it wasn't just James, then it really wouldn't mean much. Berman says, I've shown why that doesn't work in Galatians 1:18-19, where James is called Jesus' brother. It's because the term is used to differentiate James from Cephas, to identify him in a way that clarified his distinctive relationship with Jesus, indicating what he was that Cephas was not. But no one can think that Cephas, Peter, was not also Jesus' brother in the spiritual sense, so the interpretation doesn't work. Paul states in 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16 that he blames the Jews for having Jesus killed. And in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about that the rulers of the age had Jesus crucified. Now, I don't see any evidence anywhere here that Paul thinks that Jesus was crucified in heaven or the firmament or any of that stuff, but it is happening on earth. One way or another, earthly powers are having Jesus killed. We lost John.
Yeah, I just saw him drop off too.
I'll reach out to him.
Yeah, what happened?
Mm-hmm.
He was. I don't feel comfortable continuing if there's a.
I stopped the clock at 3 minutes and 44 seconds.
I'm getting communications that his computer went blue screen of death. So
that sucks. I hate
he's
it when
coming
that
back
happens.
on. I will do my best to carry the water at this point. He'll be back on soon, but I'm going to do my best to listen to you and make sure that we respond accordingly.
Okay. Hopefully he can get back on soon. I mean, I'm willing to wait for him to come back if everybody else here is fine with that. But,
Okay.
Dennis, do you want me to continue, or do you want me to wait on John to return?
I think you should continue.
All right. Just I guess fill in John behind the scenes.
Yep. I'm actually being told by both John and his wife that he's still listening to what's going on while his computer's rebooting. So he's still with us in spirit.
Well, that works too. All right, so let's get back on the clock. So as I've said previously before, where is the evidence that Jesus was crucified in heaven or the firmament? Where is this evidence? We don't have any examples of Jesus being of other people, other mythological figures or historical figures in any way, or legends or etc. being crucified in heaven. Crucifixion happened on earth. Oh, there he is, and so my point is, if we don't have any examples of other people being crucified in heaven, then what justifies saying that Jesus was more probably crucified in heaven in the early Christian tradition before he was supposedly euhemerized into a historical figure? In the Gospel of Thomas, so now I'm going to be looking at other extra biblical Christian traditions, but James the Just here is understood to succeed Jesus. Again, how could Christians believe that James succeeded Jesus if Jesus did not exist? And again, this goes back to what I was talking about earlier regarding Berman, Jesus the apocalyptic preacher. We see this in Mark 13, and we also see this in the Gospel of Thomas regarding the destruction of the temple or casting the world ablaze. We also have another tradition, and this has to do with Hebrew Matthew, in which James is understood to succeed Jesus, because James was waiting for Jesus to rise from the dead. So this tradition is more developed than what we see in the other text I was just mentioning, like Thomas specifically. But here, Jesus appears to James after the resurrection, according to this text, and James is appointed to be the successor to Jesus. He's specifically called. He's specifically being referred to as my brother. He's the brother. He's the brother of Jesus. And there are early mentions of the Gospel of Thomas. The Papias part that one's a bit more problematic. There's something about a logia of Thomas. So I do admit it's not entirely clear if it's the Gospel of Thomas. Hippolytus in Oregon and also the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions do attest to the Gospel of Thomas prior to Cyril of Jerusalem. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, but Elaine Pagels does make an argument that John was familiar with the Gospel of Thomas. So I'm going to go over a couple more slides before I hand it over to Dennis to complete the introduction. But I do think that Antiquities 1833 is either largely or wholly authentic to Josephus. I think Josephus is trying to tell us what he heard about Jesus. And he says here that both Jewish authorities and Romans opposed Jesus simultaneously. I think this supports Dennis's argument that Jesus might have been a Torah reformer. And if he were a Torah reformer, Jesus would be opposed by both Jewish authorities and Romans alike, especially if there may be a rebellious tendency involved in that. And I don't think that contradicts what Bart Ehrman says about the apocalyptic preaching of Jesus either. I think they can all go together. I don't see a problem with that at all. In the James passage, James is referred to as the brother of Jesus. And Jesus is specifically referred to as who was called Christ. Now, that's a very strange thing for a Christian to write if that was an interpolation by a Christian. And I do think there are problems with saying that certain things in the testimonium were interpolated. We could get into the arguments about the original reconstruction of the testimonium, but I don't want to get into that because I just take Dr. Zinner's position currently on the testimonium. I don't subscribe to the necessity of reconstructing an earlier version of the testimonium, but that's neither here nor there right now. I want to focus on the James passage now. Jesus Outside the New Testament by Robert Van Voorst. The overwhelming majority of scholars holds that the words the brother of Jesus called Christ are authentic, as is the entire passage in which it is found. The passage fits its context well as for its content. Cuts off there. Not going to go to the next page. I just want to cite this page. So I'll say this, as I've said it before. To me, the testimonium and the James passage rise or fall. I do think that James being called the brother of Jesus called Christ would insinuate that the testimonium did exist before the James passage. So if one were to turn out to be an interpolation, then I suppose it would knock the other down with it. And with that being said, I'm going to let Dennis complete the introductory argument.
Thank you, gentlemen. I want to say first that in this conversation and in earlier ones, you get euhemerism backwards. Euhemerus did not say that divine figures became human. Go ahead and check the encyclopedia. Euhemerus was trying to explain the existence of the gods by saying that humans become divine. You get that? So
Yep.
What we're talking about with saying that a heavenly figure became humanized is anti-euhemerism. It is not euhemerism. I think that's huge. The second thing is, Aaron, I think that you were very good in talking about how Christology developed out of lots of mythical material, but most of it that you cited was from Judaism. I would make your case even stronger. So much of the mythologizing of Jesus in Paul
5 minutes.
shows parallels also in Greco-Roman mythology. And my student, Richard C. Miller, I think has shown that pretty clearly. So the discussion should not be for us the Christian Christ. The Christian Christ is a mythological development of traditions about a historical personality. Now, one of the things that you did not mention at all is the Q document. Now, of course, the Q document is a hypothetical text, but one needs something like that to explain the synoptic problem. And you really did not deal with your solution to the synoptic problem, because we have lots of material, especially in Matthew and Luke. They did not get out of Paul. They did not get out of Mark. And by the way, Mark is hugely mythological over and over again. So
Oh, he broke up there. Hold on.
Okay, for
the Christian Christ, Paul's object of worship, that he is called the Messiah, the Christ, is mythological. I agree with you about that. That doesn't mean that Jesus didn't exist as a way of trying to explain how you have Jesus euhemerized. So the word euhemerism works better for me than it does for you. Now, the Q document, in my view, must have existed, and it can never be fully reconstructed unless we find material evidence for it. And I've talked to Richard Carrier about this over and over again, and he is a Q skeptic altogether. And my guess is that most mythicists are. But because I think that that is really the Achilles heel of your position, that you have to explain. By the way, in my view, the Logoi of Jesus was not written by a Christian at all. It was written by a radical Jew, very much like Cesar Chavez or Martin King or Mahatma Gandhi. He was opposing the powers of Judaism at the time that have two centers, and we know this from Josephus. One center was the nomikoi, that is, those who were Torah enforcers, like the Pharisees and scribes. The other were chief priests and other managers of the temple, and we know that they at the time were corrupt, and they were fleecing people. John the Baptist also apparently was offering forgiveness of sins without sacrifice as an alternative to temple corruption. So here we're talking about a Jew, not a Christian, not a heavenly character, but a reformer of Judaism. And I have a book coming out, I'm hoping to have it out in a few months, called Feuding Gospel Authors, in which the gospel authors argue with each other about who Jesus was. And the winner of the debate, in my view, is a combination of
1 minute.
of Q and of Luke, especially Luke's use of Q. And he's remembering Jesus as a Jewish reformer, trying to make the law more flexible. That's why in the logo of Jesus, Jesus heals on the Sabbath. He lets people glean on the Sabbath. And in my reconstruction, he forgives a woman who does not repent.
You have 30 seconds if you'd like to take it.
Da 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 da.
I
All
think
right.
we completed our introduction.
Okay, well, we're through the introductory rounds, gentlemen. So now we're going to move on to 4 10-minute rounds, and that would be 10 minutes per team. So we're back to Aaron Adair and John Gleason. I don't know how you guys are going to do it, if one's going to go or the other, but we're going to move on to round 1 of the debate. Did Jesus exist? When you're ready, I don't know who's going to go first, or as soon as you start, I'll start.
John, do you want to say a few things? You're muted right now, John.
Mute yourself.
Right. Sorry. I was trying to be respectful. Yeah, I do have a few things to talk about here. I guess kind of. Sorry. What?
I'm starting the clock.
Okay. So I guess just working from what Dennis was saying back to Berman. One thing I want to say is that I know at least I generally adhere to Mark Goodacre's case against Q. He has a fantastic website where he addresses a lot of the Q stuff. He's got several different scholarly supplementary materials on top of his case against Q. It's primarily based on Austin Ferrer's hypothesis. Dispensing. It's called On Dispensing with Q. It's just marking priority and everything. Then there's Michael Golder's Is Jew a Juggernaut? Edward C. Hobbs, A Quarter Century Without Q, and then a couple of Mark Goodacre's scholarly articles talking about that. So there are solutions to the synoptic problem that do not involve Q and show that Q is just simply not needed. So that's my first contention there. We didn't address it because it doesn't seem to really that seems to be a thing that's perfectly handled already in the scholarship. And then I'll just hit on maybe a couple things because I don't want to take up too much time here. Jacob mentioned a few, verses in Paul's epistles, like Galatians 1:19, I believe Romans 1:3 was one of them. Is that right, Jacob?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think Romans 9:5 might have been one too, and then Galatians 4:4. So those all do not actually prove an earthly existence for Jesus. In fact, the portions like Galatians 4:4 and Galatians, not Galatians 1:19, but I believe the Romans 1:3, both of those, Paul specifically uses the Greek, in the Greek, he uses words specifically meant for like manufacturing objects. And under the mythicist hypothesis, that explanation would work because we view God as generating Jesus's body in the heavens, using the seed of David that he could have collected. And in fact, in the Old Testament, God says that he would collect David's seed in order to rise up this Messiah figure. So, I mean, that's all explained by what's already in Jewish scripture, as well as in Paul's understanding of like Greek. And then there's the Brothers of the Lord situation. The Adelphoi in Greek specifically talks or is indicative of both blood relations as well as fictive kinships. Considering how Paul uses Adelphoi in all of his letters, and how mostly, if not all the time, uses it to refer to like fictive kinships, I feel like you would need to make a very strong argument based in like Greek in order to actually overcome the likelihood that Paul was just speaking about fictive kinships. And then the brother of the Lord, Jacob mentioned how if that is just used of several different individuals, then it no longer becomes special. Like it's no longer some kind of special title. And I would say that that's the argument that mythicists are making, is that brother of the Lord was not a special title. It was a title that was used by by Paul to indicate all Christians. And in fact, this was probably the title or the label that was used of Christians before the word Christian ever came into their vocabulary. So yeah, I'll let I have more things that I could say, but I don't want to take up all of our time, so I'm gonna let Aaron fill in with whatever he needs to say.
Okay, so I will try to be fast. So first off, the statement from First Thessalonians that the Jews killed Jesus, this is widely considered to at least be tampered with. It's very likely that it's a complete interpolation. This is not something that mythicists came up with. This is something been noted in the scholarly literature for a while, that it looks out of place and looks like an interpolation. So I don't think we can use interpolations for what Paul said. So I don't think that's good evidence. Jacob also said there's no evidence of any killing or crucifying in space. I will again note that Plutarch talks about that the Isis-Osiris myth is actually about things happening in outer space, and including the killing of Osiris is actually something happening in space. And he says that this is actually what is going on in all the other major religions at that time. So saying that there's no evidence for that is not correct. And also, I showed explicitly from the Ascension of Isaiah, saying this is where Jesus goes to get killed, this is where the killing happens, and this is where he is resurrected from where the angel of death is in the firmament. So I would say not only is there evidence, there's a lot of evidence that that is the case. You mentioned, of course, our issue with the sperm of David issue. How does that work with a heavenly being? again, this is actually explicitly in 4th Ezra, that it says the Messiah who has been kept until the ends of days will arise from the posterity of David. So somehow this figure, and I have a few other quotes here to note, that this was a heavenly son of God. This was a pre-existent Messiah, was around from the beginning of the creation of the world, and had not been seen until the end of days, until coming in the last days with this person somehow arise from David. So I'm not saying this is the cosmic sperm bank, but they apparently have some concept in Judaism at roughly the same time of Christianity that they could believe in a heavenly being also somehow be descendant from David, even though he's not there in the biological sense. And again, I will note that's in part because the word used here for arise in the Syriac is this strange word for the rising of astronomical bodies that we see used elsewhere, ultimately derived from the star prophecy of Numbers 24:17. So not only do I don't think this is a problem for mythicism, the strange language being used here for this heavenly man also being used for Jesus in the same sort of way in the Epistle to the Hebrews, this should actually make us say there's something weirder going on here rather than it being somehow evidence for mythicism. We're of course limited on time, so I must be quick on a few other things, but we'll get into another round. Mentioned the Gospel of Thomas and having James as a leader there. When was the Gospel of Thomas written? There was some evidence given that it's at least before the Gospel of John. I can accept that, but does that mean it's before all the Gospels, let alone it's very ancient? No evidence for that is given. None of that seems to be clear. I will hop on the Q document from Dennis because I've got your work, Dennis. I do try to appreciate the argument there, and I am willing to say, for the sake of argument, that we'll accept that your Q hypothesis is correct, that there is some underlying source to Matthew and the other synoptics and so on. But I look at that reconstruction and I don't see a reason to place it before 70. So it seems to be not any more ancient than the other Gospels, and it has things that also look mythical. It has Jesus chatting with Satan. It has Jesus predicting his resurrection. It has him predicting the destruction of the temple. It has explanations for the delay of the parousia. These are the sorts of things that look like that later Christian communities would try to be using to explain things. So it doesn't look like I have a reason to think it's more historically reliable than the other Gospels, which again are full of what's it in terms of historical reliability. And I'm using the word what's it to try to be slightly censored. And lastly, that I got Euhemerism backwards. Euhemerus was trying to explain where the myths of the gods come from. And in his original story, he has it so that Zeus was actually just a dude. And because he was so awesome that people thought he had to have been a god and set up worship to him, even though he died and was buried, and that you could actually go and visit his tomb. In fact, even well into later antiquity, people were visiting Crete and the tomb of Zeus as if it was a religious site. But it's worth noting that that's what Euhemerus was trying to do. Other people were basically taking gods and making them into human adventurers. This was done in, for example, what's called the Phrygian literature, where it basically has Dionysus not as the god of wine, but some dude going around having adventures and having a few good drinks along the way. So the idea of taking already established gods and putting them in history, that is something the Euhemeristic people did at that time. Did you say I'm out of time?
That was 1 minute.
1 minute. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of two different ways that I see Euhemerization being used. One, to basically say, oh, you just believe in deified humans, that you just basically believed people that were Zeus were real, and some Christians did that. And others used it to basically encode myths about their beliefs. I see this being used in the Isis Osiris cult. I see this also used in some of the Hermetic literature to basically turn Hermes into just a guy, but internally say Hermes was actually a god revealing things to them. So I think Euhemerism is more diverse and more complex than that, but that we can have for another round of discussion, along with the many other points that we'll have to have our back and forths on.
Well, you're almost perfect. You're at 9 minutes and 53 seconds. So that's halfway through the first round. Thanks a lot for that, guys. So Jacob and Dennis, it's on you guys. I don't know who wants to go first. Reset my clock here and grab my pen. Sorry about that. All right, you gonna go first, Jacob, or is Dennis?
Yeah, I'm gonna go first. I just realized I was muted. Okay. I'll go first for a little. So I'll talk a little bit about a couple of slides, and I'll let Dennis discuss the rest. So we do have literature like first, second apocalypses of James, and one of them was cited in the one of the previous slides from John and Aaron's team. And it says here there is a James. You got a James the Just, who is specifically identified as the son of Feuda. Now, the one thing that I must say is I think there needs to be some caution, because I'm not entirely sure if this is really intended to be James, the brother of the brother of the Lord in Galatians, because James, the son of Feuda, is, well, look at his father. He's not the same. Are we going to say that's the same person as Alphaeus? I believe I remember that somebody may have made a linguistic argument that there's a link between Alphaeus and Feuda, if I remember correctly, but I think it's strained here. And this James the Just dies later. He dies in the 60s. He parallels the death of James and Josephus, but my point that I'm trying to make is, notice that how they're being very specific that this James is the spiritual brother of Jesus. And I don't feel like the same kind of distinction is being made about James, the brother of the Lord, that we see in the New Testament. And another thing I'd like to address, because I feel like that's going to come up one way or the other, kind of already has. And so in the Ascension of Isaiah, it puts Jesus' death, or at least it has Jesus coming to earth, and yes, it does have him dying on earth. There is no earlier version, unless you believe in a hypothetical earlier edition of the Ascension of Isaiah, I guess proto-Ascension of Isaiah, that puts Jesus' death in the firmament or in heaven. We don't have solid proof that that thing actually existed. I know that Richard Carrier talks about this in his book on the Historicity of Jesus, page 43. He cites from the Latin text, "And I saw one like a son of man dwelling among men and in the world, and they did not know him." In all versions of the Ascension of Isaiah that we have, Jesus, one way or another, ends up on earth. We don't have a version of the text extant that puts Jesus' death in his entire ministry squarely in heaven. That's the point that I'm trying to make. That was only a couple of slides I wanted to show, but I do want to make one more point. A point that I was trying to make earlier is that we don't have examples of crucifixion happening in heaven with other historical or mythological beings. That's really the point that I was trying to make earlier. Maybe I wasn't too clear on that. I'm trying to say is we don't have crucifixion happening in the heaven or the firmament. And I know that certain examples have been brought up to me in the past, like from the Epistle to the Hebrews, which is not written by Paul. Oh, everything happening on heaven can also happen on earth. But the problem is, if it happened if we're saying if we're having duplication theology, if it happened in heaven, but it still happened on earth, you still have a Jesus on earth. So, Dennis, I'd like you to finish the rest of what I'm saying.
I just want to bring some clarity to the discussion instead of setting it up as a debate. The first thing that I'd like to say is that Mark Goodacre is a friend of mine, and we've talked about the Q document, and his position is not that there was no Q document. It's that it's impossible to reconstruct it, and because of that, one needs to probably put it in the freezer until somebody can thaw it out. He argues that there are other sources, though, that Mark may have used, but he does not deny the historical Jesus. In fact, I don't know of a single scholar who does synoptic work who denies the historical Jesus. What my position is the Q document shows no signs of the heavy mythologizing that you find in Mark and so on. Now, what Aaron said is right. You have mythological stuff going on already in Q. So it's not to say that the Q document is a
5 minutes.
historical a record. In fact, I'm in the book that I've coming out with soon, I don't claim that there's any word in Q that we can attribute to Jesus himself. Rather, we can understand his social location and why Pilate felt it important to crucify him, because he was so difficult in creating so many problems, just as the way, by the way, that John the Baptist had done. And that's why Herod Antipas had him killed. The other thing to note, and this is not, again, a part of an argument, we're assuming that in antiquity, there are only two types of characters. That is, human. A population of ancient mythology is much more complex. It includes not only the gods, but the gods themselves are stratified. Then you have and it's not just the Olympians. The Olympians sleep with mortals and create heroes. So many of the heroes in the Homeric epics have one divine parent and one mortal parent. So what do we do with the heroes? Then you also have demons and angels that are non-human emissaries, and the gods have different functions for the creation of the world. So I think we need to understand the ancient mythological population with much more fine-tuned assessments and how we understand it. Now, the other is that it is much more common, because of this issue of the heroes, that mortals distinguish themselves either with great power or wisdom or daring, and because of that, they're considered to be superhuman and therefore given divine traits. You see this with the Roman emperors. You see this with the heroes of the Greeks, that Achilles is willing to die at Troy because he wants to have eternal renown. So the idea of moving from being a human to being glorified as a divinity is a part of the ancient religious landscape far more powerfully. Let me say this as emphatically as I can, much more commonly than the gods becoming human. And just prima facie, I think that you can say that that what we find in the mythologies related to Jesus, and again, I'm saying that the Q document has a mythology. Its mythology is that Jesus is superior to Moses. He's the promised prophet like Moses, and to do so, he mythologizes. But I think the pattern is much more likely to move from a glorified human that needs to be, and whose crucifixion needs to be explained, than to have the gods euhermerize. I'm trying to get euhermerous into a verb.
1 minute left.
I'm done. No, I'm done.
Okay.
I'll say
You're
one
at
more thing.
9 minutes. Go ahead, Jacob.
I just wanted, because I forgot to bring this up earlier. We don't have manuscripts of First Thessalonians. That's missing. First Thessalonians 2:13-16. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna stop the clock. That's the first round there, guys. We're going into round two. If you guys want to piggyback off of Dennis's round one, feel free to. If you want to switch it up, it's on you guys.
So, John, I think I have some stuff prepared that I think will also engage well with some of the things that Dennis was saying. So, if I may.
Yeah.
Time ready?
Yep.
All right, and go. Okay, so one of the things that Dennis was mentioning was in comparison to like the social setting of the time and seeing that how Jesus can fit there, and especially with comparison to figures like John the Baptist and that. This reminds me of some of the issues that I think are actually problems for historicity, and I do want to bring them up here. So let me start off with the idea of, well, who killed Jesus? Earlier on, we mentioned a little bit that in 1 Corinthians 2, it talks about the archons of this aeon are the ones who crucified Jesus, and if they had known who Jesus actually was, they wouldn't have done so. Does this sound like the normal language one would use for the Roman authorities executing someone? This is actually a little bit strange, and all the stranger, because why would humans not want to basically do this sacrifice that helps bring on heaven on earth? This is a little bit strange, but would make sense if the rulers of this universe, or this lower universe, the demons, were doing that. That could make some sense. But there's an interesting verse in Revelation 1:7 where John is talking about his visionary stuff, and he says that when Jesus comes back in the cloud, that every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. This is again quoting back to Zechariah 12, but even those who pierced him are going to see him. Revelation is usually dated somewhere in the 90s. If Jesus is killed in the 30s, how could the people who pierced Jesus still be alive to see him come back? This already kind of somehow presupposes that the people who killed Jesus are still somehow around, and this would fit better the demonic model than the human model. Here's another issue I've noticed with our setup. So the very, very basic Christian narrative is that Jesus goes to Jerusalem, something happens, and he gets executed by the authorities. I'm leaving it extremely abstract of what that is, just to be as minimal detail as possible. Later Christians come along and preach Jesus being awesome, and they're doing so in Jerusalem. And we know the Jerusalem church itself lasted for decades, given the letters of Paul. Now, here's the thing, though. Jesus was considered a crucified criminal by the Romans and the city authorities. They're the ones who put him to death in all of the historical narratives that we have. So how is it that the authorities killed Jesus, but let his cult continue in the same city that Jesus was executed? You're saying this person is not worth keeping alive. We have to kill him because he's causing some sort of angst, but they're going to let the community around him still grow and live there and proclaim that he is the Son of God and is going to come with a heavenly army, and they're just going to let that go? That seems very strange. Why would the cult to the man the authorities deem worthy of execution be allowed to exist there for decades? That is strange on the historical model. Also, a thing that's very strange on the historical model is that we have other narratives of Jesus that put him in a completely different time. In the Talmud and other medieval Jewish sources, we actually have Jesus placed approximately 100 BCE. He's dying under Alexander Jannaeus. So we have like literally a century transportation of Jesus back in time. How does that happen? And this wasn't just Jews in the Talmud. We also have a Jewish Christian sect told to us by Epiphanius, also believing the same thing, that Jesus died during the reign of Alexander Jannaeus. How does such a narrative come to exist given a historical Jesus? I don't know of any historical explanation for this oddity. And also, there's the thing with the extremely high Christology of Jesus in the earliest literature we have. That it's not just some later development that grows and grows and grows. We see it in our earliest forms that we see here in the Philippians hymn, where Jesus is already in the form of God and then takes on human form to basically descend to our world and then become highly exalted to become Lord. This is, like I say, the same sort of super high Christology, so high, in fact, that Giza Vermesh said that this had to be an interpolation because it's too much like the Gospel of John. It can't possibly be original. This is how much of an oddity this is to other biblical scholars of renown. Now, let's contrast this, though, with John the Baptist, because I think it's very interesting because they live in the same place in the same time, based on historical narratives. John preached some sort of eschatological kingdom and even called a Christ or Messiah figure. He was also killed by political authorities sometime in the 30s, basically the same time Jesus is supposed to be killed. And there's even some evidence that some people consider John to somehow be resurrected. We see this popping up in Mark, that people thought Jesus was somehow the resurrected John the Baptist. And in the Mandean literature, they also say that John's spirit ascended to heaven. So basically, not say the bodily resurrection that Jesus does coming out of a tomb, but still basically that kind of ascent to heaven. So a huge amount of similarity right from the get-go, but no one ever said John was divine or an angel. There isn't the high Christology for John like there is for Jesus. And also, as I mentioned, with the issue of Jesus's cult still growing and thriving in Jerusalem, John's cult couldn't stick around. They had to, from what we can tell, leave after John was killed. The Mandeans basically talk about having to, get out of Dodge, and that's why they're now in places like Iraq rather than in Palestine. So if John's followers couldn't stick around the old territory, why were Jesus able to, in the exact same city, under the exact same authorities for decades? And also, no one seriously has any issues with what time John was placed in historically. There's no narratives that I know of that put John a century out of time. All these things, I think, are easier to explain on mythicism. If Jesus was originally killed by demons, this solves the sorts of things that I mentioned that we see in Revelation and 1 Corinthians that talk about the archons of this aeon, or those who originally pierced Jesus decades later still being around to watch him come back. If there was no historical Jesus that caused a rabble-rousing in Jerusalem, then there's no political issue with the Christians having their community in Jerusalem itself. This now no longer becomes a problem that needs to be explained on mythicism. If Jesus stories were invented later, different groups will put Jesus in different times. This could be understood, for example, on the Daniel 70 weeks of years prophecy. We have from our records that Julius Africanus was able to calculate that out and get the death of Jesus happening in 30 CE. If we use the exact same prophecy, we could actually also use it to get Jesus coming into the world in 103 BCE. So in particular, the prophecy is supposed to start with something going on with the Jerusalem temple. And for example, the great commenter Rashi started this with the destruction of the temple in 586. Well, if you take the exact same prophecy system that Jews and Christians were using and just go forward 69 weeks of years, that gets the final weeks of years starting in 103 BCE, which happens to also be the first year of Alexander Jannaeus' reign. So if we use this, we can explain both sets of data of where Jesus is placed. The historical position doesn't explain one of these very well at all. And lastly, the high Christology of Jesus is completely expected if Jesus was originally imagined to be the heavenly man, the heavenly figure come down to do activities. John the Baptist isn't treated that same way, and so that would explain why there is not the high Christology for John as there is for Jesus. So these are just a few of the issues that I look at and say we can make more sense about it on mythicism than on historicity, or at the very least, historicity needs to come up with explanations to help the field move forward, while mythicism can at least provide plausible explanations on that background theory for what's going on here. So I know I only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to go very quick on these other things. Ascension of Isaiah 11, this was brought up. The textual witnesses for this point are unfortunately terrible. You brought up the Latin version. If you look at the Ethiopic version, they have no words in common. One is not a shortening of the other. They seem to be completely independent, and also they don't fit the rest of the text. You said there's no evidence for crucifixions in space. Again, in chapters 9 and 10, this is exactly what we are told is going to be happening to the Messiah, this being him killed in space. The fact that the chapter 11, which has these huge anomalies in the textual tradition, tells us that we shouldn't be trusting this. Now, you're saying there's no manuscript for this. If you want to follow that approach, then you're going to have to say to Dennis, you can't believe in his Q hypothesis because there's no document for that. You're going to have to tell the Old Testament scholars to throw out the documentary hypothesis. There's no JE, D, and P floating around separately. You're going to have to throw out most of Old and New Testament studies if you want to take that position for how we need to argue about the manuscript traditions for the Ascension. What I'm doing is saying, hey, this part of the text is unstable. We see that it differs drastically in our two major traditions, while conversely, the parts that are more stable don't even agree with that unstable portion. So that's why I would say that the part that you're citing there is almost certainly some sort of tampering at a later point. And if we go by the parts that are more original, that we can see are more consistent across the manuscript traditions, it shows it has that Messiah figure killed in space. And lastly thing I'll note here is back with Dennis saying that the Gospel of Mark may have sources. There may be some cue to Mark. And the operative word, though, is may. Do we have evidence Mark had sources, and sources that we would consider historical? That's the key question. That's basically all Jesus studies as our issue here. Can we actually show any sources go back to the man? And if we say there might be, that's not evidence. And that's the problem that we have with Jesus studies generally. What evidence do we actually have after 200 plus years of examining this question with a huge number of intelligent, hardworking folks? And our best is, dude got killed? This is unfortunately why I see we should be trying a different avenue. And maybe in another round, I will try to show examples of how a mythicist model could actually help New Testament studies move forward. But I've absorbed all the time because I'm a greedy bastard. I apologize, John. I never let you speak again because I'm just that bad a person.
And that's your time. You're right at 10 minutes.
I'm perfectly fine with that. That was great.
Aaron, I'm insulted. So I'm not going to be very nice right now.
I apologize already.
There are so many evidences in Mark of overlaps with the Q document that he no doubt had to know traditions or likely the text itself.
Dennis, can I ask a question real quick? Or are we,
problem?
are we in a discussion right now, or
We're
I
in
started
the
the
final
timer.
round for.
Yeah, you're in the final second round.
oh, okay, that's my bad. Sorry.
Oh, Dennis, continue what you were saying.
There are so many evidences that Mark has sayings traditions that overlap with the Q document. These are called doublets. Then we also have conflations. Then we also have a blending of sayings. And I'm really impressed, Aaron, by your control of lots of the Pauline material and the extra canonical. I think you really are flat-footed when it comes to the synoptic problem. And I think that is the Achilles heel of mythicism, that you latch on Paul. And again, I agree that Paul's Christ is mythological, probably also with Greek mythology thrown in. But we're not talking about the Pauline Christ exist. We're talking about a Jewish prophet named Jesus who existed. And the evidence is really, in my view, uncontrovertible. And here's my question to you. I'll try to be nice about this one. I don't know why you have to be critical of the historical Jesus. I don't know what you gain from it. Now, I'm an atheist, so is Jacob, as he has told me. So I'm not trying to protect Christian orthodoxy. I just don't know why you would need to say that that there was a historical Jesus who then became euhemerized and exalted in the way he was. By the way, on the issue of location, we don't know how big the Jerusalem church was, but we do know that John did not have a community. People came to be baptized by him and then go home. So I just don't think that that's a helpful argument. Anyway, Jacob, I may be taking your time.
Oh, no problem. I'm just going to respond. I'm going to respond to a few points. I just threw up a few verses here in this slide just to get the point across that early Christian tradition outside of Paul's authentic letters. Because I know 1 Timothy is pseudo-Pauline. I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying Paul wrote that. In the early Christians, from my point of view, I think clearly put Jesus' death under the reign of Pontius Pilate. Now, in the 3rd century, you have Origen of Alexandria in his Contra Celsum, referring to an individual called Celsus, who claimed that Jesus was born of Mary by a Roman soldier called Panthera, or Pantera. Now, Panthera is supposedly Jesus' father, but Celsus does not claim that Jesus lived in another century. Does Celsus claim that Jesus died under Alexander Jannaeus? Because I know that in the argumentation that Jesus is mentioned in the Talmud, those who make that argument will often conflate Jesus ben Pandera with the biblical Jesus. I just want to get that point across before I continue. And so Origen keeps going on, and he talks more about what Celsus is saying, but he also talks about what Josephus is saying, because he also talks about Josephus mentioning James passage. I know you both think that the James passage is an interpolation, or at least partly brother of Jesus called Christ that was added, or at least called Christ was added. That's what I meant to say. It's because I know you both think that Jesus ben Damnius is the brother of the James mentioned in the James passage. And I just want to be clear, I don't agree with that. So, and I know that Dennis does not agree. Dennis would concur with me on the James passage. And so what I'm trying to say is, it's not really clear if the Talmud is talking about Jesus.
5 minutes.
It's not clear that Jesus is that any of the Jesuses in the Talmud are really about our Jesus. And it would seem like to me that in a much later time, the Jesuses, some of them, one of them, or several of them were confused with the biblical Jesus. So Peter Schaeffer, he talks a bit about Jesus in the Talmud. He talks about how there were redactions, and there were how these Jesuses in the Talmud were developed over a long period of time. I just want to bring that up here because I think that is important to note that. So I'll read from some of this. He says, "This, I will posit, is the historical message of the late Talmudic evidence of Jesus, a proud and self-confident message that runs counter to all that we know from Christian and later Jewish sources. I will demonstrate that this message was possible only under the specific historical circumstances in the Sasanian Babylonia, of a Jewish community that lived in relative freedom, at least with regard to Christians, quite different from conditions in Roman and Byzantine Palestine." I'm going to now go back a little bit earlier. "They ridicule Jesus' birth from a virgin as maintained by the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and they contest fervently that the claim that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. Most remarkably, they counter the New Testament Passion story with its message of the Jews' guilt and shame as Christ's killers. Instead, they reverse it completely. Yes, they maintain we accept responsibility for it, but there is no reason to feel ashamed because we rightfully executed a blasphemer and idolater. Jesus deserved death, and he got what he deserved. Accordingly, they subvert the Christian idea of Jesus' resurrection by having him punished forever in hell, by making clear that this fate awaits his followers as well, who believe in this impostor." So what I think happened is, you get this in even much later texts at the Toldot Yeshu, which is even later. Jesus ben Pandira is clearly being conflated with the Jesus of the New Testament, with Joseph and Pandira becoming the same person, by the way. So now he's called Joseph Pandira. They're conflated into one very specific individual. And that's the point that I wanted to make there. Even if there are references in the Talmud to the biblical Jesus, I would say that that was a result of a conflation from what we're seeing in of Jesuses that pre-existed the historical Jesus Christ, from together with the biblical Jesus. So what I'm trying to say is Yeshua ben Pandira and the biblical Jesus were merged together. As Origen is saying, Celsus is ridiculing the virgin birth story. So he's creating this story about Pantera and saying that that's the father of Jesus, which would later lead to Jesus, the biblical Jesus, being referred to as the son of Pantera in other Christian traditions, in other Christian texts, church father texts, etc., which would lead into him being confused with one or several other Jesuses that pre-existed his time. And because of that, I don't think it's very clear that Christians really believe that Jesus died in another century, lived and died in another century. One more point that I want to make real quick about the James passage before we enter our dialogue part of the discussion. If the James and Josephus is really not believed to be James the brother of Jesus, and this is an interpolation, then why would someone interpolate in there? Because this is something I'm curious about. Why would somebody interpolate in there? Yeah, I'm just finishing my point. If Damnius is the father of both James and Jesus, son of Damnius, mentioned by Josephus in the James passage, if we are to assume that Damnius is the father of that James, why would a Christian think that is actually, why would they confuse that with James and Justin anyway? Because Damnius is clearly not Jesus's father. It was supposed to be Joseph, at least as the earthly father, or stepfather if you want. If someone is a Christian and believes that God is really the father, and I'm obviously not a believer. So what I'm saying is, I don't think they would have made that confusion if Damnius really was the father of not only that Jesus, but also James. And last thing I'll say is that Jesus lived 30 years after the biblical Jesus. And so that's another reason that I don't think they would have likely have thought that was our Jesus. Because he's living later in time. He lived past the biblical Jesus, and he has a different father. I'm done.
That's your time. All right, so that's the bottom of the second round, I'll call it. It was 4 10-minute rounds. Now we're moving on to the 30-minute back and forth is what I'm assuming here. And one day I'm going to figure out there's got to be a way to put a clock up on the screen that everybody can see it, so I'm not using my stopwatch here. Either way, moving on to the back and forth Q&A segment, if you want to call it that.
Sean,
yes.
May I ask a question of you before we start?
Well, sure.
Will there be an opportunity for viewers to chat with us? Are you collecting information?
Yeah, we're going to get to that. I mean, we have the super chat questions. There are at least 2 right now that I saw. There's been a lot of comments. I have to go back, but yeah, we're going to get to that part too.
Could I
move on to that first? Unless you guys want to bring some super chat questions in now.
My question: whether we want to invite them into the discussion.
Well, yeah, there have been some super chat comments.
We would respond to each other.
Somebody was cheering you on there, Dennis, at some point. But there are a lot of comments today. I'm moving my cursor back and forth. Here's one right here.
But I think I would like to give Aaron and John a chance to respond to some of the things that were out there. But I think it'd be great if we could invite the chat into the discussion.
He's doing that. He's doing that right now.
Right now we have My Unfinished Journey. Hail Nero, Hail G and guests, and Hail Critical Scholarship. I noticed one higher up. There's been a lot of comments. Here's another one here. My Unfinished Sock. Don't kill Osiris. Like and share the stream instead. I haven't really kept up with the questions like I usually do because there are a lot of comments today. I have a quick question. I mean, Dennis, not to be inflammatory on my end, but like, is a conversation with Dr. Adair and myself like not enough? Like, I guess I just feel like it's a debate between the 4 of us. Like, shouldn't we have the debate first and then invite people to add their commentary? Like, I don't know. I've only been doing this for about 12 years. I feel like, a debate is like we have the debate and then commenters come in. So like, that's all I'm asking. Like, can we have the debate or?
Well, I'm encouraging you to respond to some of the things that we talked about.
Well, but, yeah, I would love to respond.
I think it'd be great.
Dennis.
I think it'd be great to invite the chat in. That's all.
Well, let's we can go through the super chats after. I think we should go through the super chats after we complete our 30-minute back and forth. I think that'll be
the most productive.
Yeah, let's do it like that.
I do too.
Well, let's go with that.
Okay. Can I say something because I haven't gotten to talk for a minute. Okay, so go ahead. Okay, so Dennis, in one of his responses, said that Jesus was more likely to be just a glorified human, rather than a mythological figure that was then historicized, which is the definition of euhemerization. It's taking mythological figures and placing them in history.
No, that's backwards. That is backwards.
It's literally not backwards. I can Google it. I
will note that actually the secondary literature on this will say kind of both things, that it does kind of get mixed up with divinization. So I want to make sure that I'm absolutely clear that there is absolutely the process of divinization where a mortal does something and people think he's so awesome or she is so awesome that they are worthy of God status, or they actually become God somehow. The most historical example of that is probably with Julius Caesar allegedly then becoming a star, rising up to heaven, and basically becoming part of the, at least a member, some sort of member of the heavenly pantheon. So that is a clear example of divinization, and Dennis is absolutely right that that exists back then. I'm saying, though, that in the Euhemerist idea that originally from Euhemerus himself, he takes the gods of Zeus and everyone else, and they had been believed for who knows how many centuries up to his point, believed to be gods, but then creates a narrative where Zeus was a dude, and because apparently he was just doing so many amazing things that a cult formed around him, and that's why now people today believe Zeus is a god and the ultimate god of the world. So the question then for us is, in what direction does this go for Jesus? Because we can see gods existing and then being put into more historical narratives, and we definitely have historical people and legendary people becoming divinized in stories. So I'm saying both things happen in both directions, and I try to use Euhemerism to basically say divinization in the opposite direction, and also for the purpose of storytelling.
Yeah, and I will say, if you look up the definition of euhemerization, it comes from, Euhemerus, who did exactly what Aaron just said. So, like, it makes no sense to say that it's euhemerization if it's doing the exact opposite of what Euhemerus did. So I don't understand why anybody would want to suggest a reverse origin, I guess, for euhemerization. But in any case, my entire point here is that when you look at Christianity through the lens of the context that it grew up in and that it originated in, it's most definitely a mystery cult. And so when you take that into context, the mystery, other mystery cults, they typically, most if not all, if memory serves, had mythological figures at their center that were saviors that provided eternal salvation through their sacrifice. And you attain that through initiation rituals, sometimes baptisms, sometimes, and also including, ritualistic meals and everything. So like when you take that into consideration and you look at the Jesus story and see the similarities between the two, I think that it makes it more likely that he started off as a mythological figure and then was turned into a historical figure, because that's what happened. Like we talked about with Euhemerus, but there's also the Isis and Osiris with Plutarch, and I think it's Moralia, right? Where he mentions the beliefs and practices of the Isis and Osiris cult. So, I mean, when I don't see how you come to it being more likely that Jesus was a glorified human or a divinized human, rather than the other way around, considering the cultural context that Christianity grew up in.
Dennis, you want to respond?
You're ignoring the Gospels.
Well, yeah, okay, so I ignored the Gospels.
The origin of the Gospels was not a mystery cult. It was a Jewish reformer. And by the way,
No, how do you know
there is good evidence that the Q document was before the destruction of the temple. There's a saying that when you give your gifts at the sanctuary, ask for forgiveness from the person that you offended, and then offer your sacrifice. Now, it seems to me that makes sense only if the temple exists. And also in my reconstruction of Q, Jesus says, I will destroy this sanctuary that is built with hands and build another that is not made with hands. And Mark puts that on the lips of false witnesses to distance Jesus from that failed prophecy. So you don't have a saying about Jesus destroying the temple if the temple's already destroyed. So I think that really is an argument that's been overlooked entirely in gospel scholarship.
Well, so I have a few problems here. One, we can't know anything about Q, so like any statements about like reconstructions of Q, that's all fabricated information.
That is-
like it's it's a hypothetical document, and I
Ignorant
would
comment.
I would hedge my bets on the fact that other historians do not place as much emphasis on hypothetical documentation as New Testament scholars do.
No,
For
it
one.
happens all the time in classics. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, I mean, I would need evidence of that. Like I have actual historians that are saying the exact opposite, that no historian puts, like, they may use hypothetical documents, but they don't place specifically what I said was they don't place as heavy emphasis on those hypothetical documents as New Testament scholars do, because you're making proclamations about Q, a document that we can't know what was in it, who wrote it, where their information comes from, or anything like that. You've got your personal reconstruction. Hold on, Dennis. You've got your personal reconstruction of it. That's fine. I can personally reconstruct it too, and I can put whatever I need to in it that will work for my particular argument. And there's no way that you could say, "Oh, that's wrong," because
John,
there's no document to go back to.
What critical criteria for assessing the parallels in the Gospels are you going to use? Tell me what criteria.
The fair error hypothesis. I mean, I've already told you this. I use the fair error hypothesis to explain the synoptic problem. You seem to be hung up on that because your interpretation of the Gospels, as well as your historical claims, seems to be dependent upon Q existing. And I feel like that's not how, like, you should actually approach the problem.
The FAR hypothesis has been shown to be so flawed.
Who has?
Even Goodacre knows what the problems are.
Okay, if that's the case, then why does Goodacre on his website say that this is supplemental information, and why does he base his entire book, The Case Against Q, on the fair error hypothesis, specifically stating how much stronger it is than the two source hypothesis?
Because the big issue between Goodacre and myself are places where Luke is more primitive than Matthew. And there are so many examples of it that it actually makes him don't shake your head. There's so many examples of Luke's priority to Matthew. Now you've got to explain that in some way, and to do so, you have to have criteria.
Right.
On that, actually, I wanted to ask you some stuff on that, Dennis, because the process that you have of detecting primitivity, it's honestly something that I am confused by, and especially in terms of the technology. So let's use this as a learning moment for me. So one of the doublets that you think, or at least I believe you think, is more primitive in Luke versus Matthew is the blessed are the poor versus blessed are the poor in spirit, as in Matthew. Blessed and the poor is how it's found in Luke. And I think you believe the Lucan version is the more primitive. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So here's where I'm trying to understand the process, because I also believe you believe that, I believe you believe, this is too redundant, I'm sorry. Part of your case is that Luke does know Matthew, and he's also responding to Matthew to some degree. Is that correct?
Yeah, he likes to ignore Matthew, but he knows Matthew, but he does not use Matthew as a source very often. He does so, though, in the infancy narrative and in the passion narrative.
Right. And Goodacre also talks about some of the minor agreements between Matthew and Luke against Mark, which show some evidence that Luke kind of likes some of the changes that Matthew made to Mark.
I agree with that.
Okay. So here's where I'm trying to understand. So, for example, with the blessed are the poor statement, I'm trying to understand what's in front of Luke when he's composing, because he knows Matthew, and in your hypotheses also knows the logia. So he has both of these sources. Does he have both of them open at the same time? One versus the other? How do we decide that? Because I'm trying to understand how he knows these two versions and chooses one versus the other.
because he knows that the Q document retains earlier traditions about Jesus than Matthew does, and Matthew really garbles up Q. So Luke recognizes that, and he wants to. So Luke more often than not, is more faithful to Q than Matthew is.
So just to repeat, I guess my question: does he have Matthew and the Logia open at the same time and sees both of them and sees that one is better than the other?
No, I don't think so. I think he only has the Logoi of Jesus open. That's the only one he's got open. And
how do you know that, though?
That's what I'm asking right now.
That, except that so frequently he ignores Matthew.
So the thing is, I'm trying to distinguish the difference between him ignoring Matthew and him changing Matthew, because that's the other hypothesis we could be testing here.
Well, you'd have to take it really, Aaron, a case by case.
Exactly. Yes, I definitely know that, which means, I don't know, maybe you have to write a whole book about it. So I know this is a topic of extreme complexity, but I'm trying to get to the brass tacks of how these decisions are made, because for example, the way Mark Goodacre would explain this same thing is the reason Luke chooses blessed are the poor rather than blessed the poor in spirit as in Matthew is that throughout his gospel, he is concerned with the poor, while Matthew seems to step away from that particular status. So he has more poor in spirit, which, what does that mean, is a good question. So to me, this looks like it works just as well as Matthew writes this, Luke sees it, doesn't like it and changes it, versus there's another version of this phrase out there and he prefers the other version. The two look identical to me, so I don't know how you can tell the difference.
Well, okay, here's something to consider, but it's not going to solve the problem. But it's a very interesting consideration. We know that for Luke, he almost always has only one text in front of him that he's copying from. Matthew often has two. He's got Mark and the Q document, and he conflates them. Luke avoids conflation. And we do know from ancient composition that because people were writing on their laps and had a stand for their source document, it was very much more common for them to use one document at a time than to use stereo documents and then to compare them. So there's very little evidence in Luke of that kind of hybridity. There's a lot of evidence for that kind of hybridity in Matthew. So that's another reason for saying that it's likely Luke simply had one text in front of him. But it doesn't solve the problem. I think it's an interesting observation.
Yeah.
I just want to point out that Mark Goodacre has cited Michael Golder, his work on this, and Golder has said that this is there's only fallacious reasoning behind this. So I'm not convinced by the necessity for it. So I don't know. I would, it seems like there are far more New Testament scholars that are very much against this whole primitivity or primitive, like Luke's primitive passages or whatever. It seems like there's more scholars against that than for it.
I think that's way off target, honestly. That's not my understanding.
There's at least two fallacious reasons in order to make the argument that you're making. And I'm not sure exactly how you're making the argument. So, I mean, I could just direct people to Mark Goodacre's website, markgoodacre.org/Q/fallacy. And it has a list of common fallacies. And this is number 5 on the list. So, I mean, it seems to be very well handled by New Testament scholarship, especially the fair hypothesis, can explain all of these things without the need for a Q document. Still, again, I feel like this
does not deny Jesus. Okay.
I don't see. You mentioned that in one of your responses there, Dennis. I don't see how that adds anything to the conversation. We're not citing Mark Goodacre for like, evidence that Jesus didn't exist, or like an opinion that Jesus didn't exist. You asked us about the synoptic problem, and I responded with, the fair air hypothesis that provides us with everything that we need, and so we don't need, the Q hypothesis. So, I mean, that was the answer to that. So it seems very superfluous for you to bring up like the fact that Goodacre isn't a mythicist. Like that has no bearing.
So,
Which would be a red herring, by the way. That's the fallacy. It's a red herring fallacy.
I just want to say something real quick. The angle that I was taking in my argumentation, as I've done before, is I do believe in pre-Markan sources. So I do agree with Dennis that there were pre-Markan sources. The problem is that we can't be absolutely certain what was in those pre-Markan sources because we don't have them. What I will say is I don't think, regardless if Q did exist or not, it may have existed. I don't know. Regardless, irrespective if Q existed or not, I think I'm obviously still of the view that the evidence for the minimal historicity of Jesus is there, regardless if Q existed or not. That's what I'm saying.
I do want to add. Oh, sorry, Aaron. I just want to add that I think that there probably were some kind of like source material that predated, like definitely the Gospels, or were more than likely contemporaneous with Paul's writings. My point is that one, or I guess I got a few points. One, we can't know what was in them. We can't know what was said. Two, we can't know what sources that they used. And then that leads us to three, we don't know if they were independent. Like, we don't know if they were independently attested or collected, or if they were just, shit that people made up. Like those are the problems that I have with using sources like Q or M or L or any other kind of source you want to invent in order to, make your hypothesis sound legit, like, or at least sound logical. Those are the problems that I have with hypothetical sources. And I know Aaron wanted to say something too.
I did want to say that we could easily get, I don't want to say sidetracked, but it's the only word I can think of, sidetracked on the arguments about Q, because I'm happy to grant the hypothesis for the sake of argument and see where that leads us anyways. Because if we spend the next hour about doublets, I'm going to need a lot more coffee. And I know Dennis is going to teach me a thing or 10 by the time I get to the bottom of that pot. And I would love that, but I don't know if the audience would be able to handle it so well.
That's fair enough.
Yes. The main thing, though, is if there is such a Q source, does it actually add to the historicity case? And I don't know how we can accurately date it. So, and also why we would think it has traditions that can go back to the historical figure. I know Dennis has already said he doesn't think any of it can go, like, we can say this word goes back to Jesus. That's fine. But it also can fit just as well as yet one more example of gospel creation story of taking their heavenly figure and putting him in a historical setting to do amazing things. Among the things, of course, speaking with Satan, having a bit of competition with him, predicting the destruction of the temple, predicting his own resurrection, things that are not likely historical. And if that's already there in our earliest document, I don't know why we would say, and this document proves Jesus' historicity. So I think I would like to have that fleshed out a bit more for me.
But let me respond by appealing to modern literary criticism. Are you familiar with fan fiction?
Yes.
The work that's being done on fan fiction. I love.
I don't know the scholarship, but I will read some fan fiction, for better or for worse.
Fan fiction can either have fans for actual human beings or for mythological human beings. And I think what we find, even in the Q document, is fan fiction. The question is whether whether the origin of that fiction is a human being, or whether it's a created human from mythology itself. And I think the evidence is pretty strong. And I'm not trying to reproduce my arguments, but I think the argument's pretty strong that it was already with Q, it was fan fiction, but for a particular reason. Namely, that Jesus was crucified and he was a champion to lots of disoriented and, disenfranchised Jews. And the Romans killed him in order to settle the problem. I think that makes a great deal of sense. If I had a little more time, I would go back to the business of James, the Lord's brother, and why they were crucified, why they were stoned by Ananus. But I think we should let other people talk to us and see how we can answer them.
Well, but I feel like, Dennis, what we're here to do is to discuss why you think that. Like, we're not here to discuss a generalized idea of what each of us believes. Like, I don't understand why you think that. Like, I don't understand what evidence you have that seems to compel you in that direction. And I feel like that is what we're asking for in this discussion.
Well,
I feel like,
John, okay, I will say this. You talked about 3 things we can't know about Q.
mm-hmm.
What if I change that to say, these are 3 challenges to our understanding about the origin of the synoptic problem? That doesn't mean we can't know about them. It means that it's a challenge to try to find a way to understand them. How do we answer those questions? And I've spent 25 years trying to answer those questions. And I think we can know with a high degree of probability about some of those issues. And so, John, we have been talking about why I think so. I've been thinking about that for 25 years.
Well, no. So, like, all that I've heard is a claim that you know these things, but not any kind of real argument. Aaron, am I wrong in this? Like, I've not heard like any real argument as to why you think that. I've heard you say that you do think that.
Let me try to interpret it as kindly as possible.
Okay.
I'm sorry?
Let me interpret it as kindly as possible. Dennis has done a gigantic amount of scholarly work and have it published in places like, I think it was out of SBL, was one of your publications, The Two Shipwrecked Gospels, if I have the title halfway correct.
That's right.
So this is not something that Dennis came up with and it hasn't been tested. It's at least gone through publication, through peer review. My understanding is, though, that the position is not popular in synoptic studies, and as in it doesn't have like a large fraction of people saying you're correct, but you have done that work to try to make that case. And I want to make that different from things just being made up. But if I can get back to something I think John was trying to get at is, even if we can do this work and say this was going back to some older source, what is the argument that any of that actually has anything to do with the historical figure? Because you mentioned the idea with fan fiction, it can be about historical people and fictional people. So how do we tell the difference in the case of Jesus? That is not something I heard from you.
Let me just say one quick thing about the Testimonium Flavianum. The stuff that Jacob put up on the screen was not the most important part of what Josephus said. In the very next sentence, he says, and let me tell you about a heteron danon, another outrage. Whatever he was talking about Jesus was an outrage. And some Christian came and purified it and made it sound really rather glorious about Jesus. Now, in the context there, Josephus is talking about human beings that are challenging traditional Judaism and where the powers had to quash them. I think that is absolutely take-home evidence that there was a human being named Jesus who was giving Rome trouble. Even if the Testimonium Flavianum is a Christian interpolation, which I think it is, whatever was there was about a human was causing trouble in Judaism, and Pilate had to deal with it.
Dennis, what comes just before the Testimony Flavianum in our Josephus? Like, what's the story right before the Jesus story?
Just before it is about Jews who are opposing Pilate's appropriation of temple funds in order to create an aqueduct. Mm-hmm. And so the temple treasury was looted by Pilate to create this aqueduct. And what we're told is that Pilate sent in people and killed 1,000 Jews in the temple. Now, that surely is an inflated number. But he says that Pilate was concerned about a stasis, a revolution in the upheaval. So both before and after the Testimonium Flavianum, we're talking about humans that are giving Jews a hard time and therefore Romans a hard time. And he's making a lesson out of Jesus so that people are not going to be following him.
So here's the thing, though, because your argument actually, I think, shows there was nothing there in the first place. Because if you just take out everything from the testimony and just let the paragraph before and the paragraph after follow, then when he talks about, and then another calamity happened, refers exactly back to what happened just under Pilate. It makes perfect sense if there was nothing there at all. That seems more in evidence than reconstructing something that we have no documentation for.
No, that is a very clever argument. And I give you credit for it. The problem is, why would an interpolator, a Christian interpolator, put the thing about Jesus right there in the middle of these two controversies? I think it would be much easier to put the statement about Jesus someplace else instead of saying that it was one of the upheavals that caused the Jewish war. So I think the location is, and Steve Mason and I would agree on this topic, by the way.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say that, I mean, it really does seem like that whoever interpolated that into Josephus's work just picked a logical location where Jesus would be mentioned and then just placed him there.
I think I would agree that basically we can imagine what the interpolator is. If they're going to talk about Jesus being killed under Pilate, put it next to the part where Pilate is showing he's the most, on his most anti-Semitic day that Josephus describes.
That's a good observation.
So I'm saying that I think works well with the evidence. And since to go with your supposition, Dennis, is that we then have to basically take the text we have, change it into something we don't have to make it fit, while we could just say, hey, this clearly doesn't fit. If it's removed, it follows fine. I think mine is the more probable. Also, this kind of goes contrary in our argument differently than what Jacob would say, because if we don't have documentation, you can't even make your own argument, Dennis. So just I want to show that Jacob and Dennis are fighting each other, even though they're being nice about it.
Well, really, just so I add clarity there, all I'm saying is that if the testimonium were tampered with, I think it would be difficult to reconstruct what the original said. There have been different attempts to reconstruct what the hypothetical original said. But
you've also said that you actually follow another person saying the testimonium as is completely authentic and completely believable that this is what Josephus would have written.
That's true. There are people
Dr. Samuel Zinner makes an argument that it could be interpreted in a different way. As I would recommend seeing the videos I did with him.
So let's actually then talk about one line from that.
Okay.
Where it says, he was the Christ, or I should say more specifically, this was the Christ. Hos Christos, obviously I need more coffee. Hol Christos, Hestos ein. This was the Christ, or in Yoda speak, the Christ this was. That seems impossible for a non-Christian to write. And if you're saying Zinner has a way of interpreting that for it to mean other than he is the Christ, I have to start doubting his reading skills. And I will also note that the only place Zinner actually has published this is in the Journal of Higher Criticism, a journal that I don't think you respect anymore, Jacob. So I'd be cautious
You're right. I don't
to use
I
those
don't
readings.
Yeah, I don't respect that journal. You're right. I am open to it being partially inauthentic. I guess I'll just say I guess I can't be sure. And when in debates we're talking about all these different positions and all these different points of view that one can have in an attempt to figure out what may have happened, what didn't happen in the past. And that's what I like about discussions like this. And sometimes it can get to one point to the next, or a little bit all over the place. But that's what I like about these discussions. And basically, if the testimonium were interpolated, and this is where I would agree with you, it would be difficult to use the later versions of the text to reconstruct what the original said. Because all the other testimoniums are attested later than Eusebius. And we don't have evidence that those versions go back before Eusebius. So that's my response. So that's why I'm saying I'm open to the possibility. I would want to look into that some more for further consideration. But in the meantime, Sean, how have we gone over 30
you guys
minutes?
are definitely at 32 minutes right now.
We were having fun.
Yeah.
It was fun. Yeah, it was fun. Why don't we look at the super chats? Were you all up for that? Maybe.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You want me to do it, Jacob, or are you going to handle it?
You can handle it.
You
It's
got
fine.
some new members
Which one
here.
did we not take yet?
Help me out here. Crimson 90.
Oh, thank you for becoming a member. I appreciate it.
Wave
of Mutilation, thank you.
Yep. Unfinished Journey, because we're going back more or less. Hail Nero.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes, and
Yeah.
Hail Critical Scholarship.
I don't know why Nero and Critical Scholarship were in the same hailing. That's
Yeah,
that's not a group I want to be in.
that's-
Not the Nero group, at least.
We have My Unfinished Sock, Don't Kill Osiris. Like and share the stream. And said some of these I went over earlier, but we'll go back over them. Here's a 1999 from the Mythic Life. So tell me with two E's what you know about Merkava mysticism, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Anybody on that? Mm-hmm.
I think the best I can say is if you are familiar with the YouTube channel Esoterica with Justin Sledge, he has at least one video about this in particular, and is very good and thorough as well as sourcing. So I would rather point to a video of someone who knows what they're talking about rather than me pretending to know what I'm talking about. But I think, though, what Mystic Life might be getting at is it may be relevant for understanding Paul's vision to the third heaven. And I think James Tabor compares Paul's vision to the Merkava mysticism, which is basically riding in God's throne to basically travel around the universe. But again, I can't speak with any confidence about what's in there.
There is one more thing I want to say before we get to the next super chat to defend Dr. Zenner. When the price controversies became serious, when he became aware of it, he disassociated from him. Does not publish in that journal anymore. Just to get that on record.
Okay.
Get to the next super chat, Sean.
All right, we have I Fish in a Tie. Give them hell, Dr. MacDonald. Mythicists are grifters.
I'm going to say no, because if anything, I'm losing money in this process. I'm the one paying for membership to SBL and going to things like that. So I have made exactly $0 from this, and quite the opposite. So I'm in it for the love of the game,
Right.
not the sweet dollars.
Yeah, and I'll say that I've spent my fair share of appearance fees for Carrier to be on my show, and also the fact that none of my Mythicist stuff does as well as whenever I'm addressing religious apologists, or even doing the call-in shows. I make more money doing the call-in shows whenever it's not concerning mythicism. So yeah, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say that we're just grifters when we're literally not making money, like a substantial amount of money from this. I mean, I make a little bit of money, but it's mostly just to play poker with.
If I also may attach this to one other thing, because earlier on the debate, Dennis was asking the question of why are we mythicists? Like, what are we gaining out of this? And I think I should address that a bit, because for me, this is not a part of a crusade against Christianity or anything like that, because I don't think this is even a worthwhile way of trying to do that. To me, this is just trying to answer a historical question, and what model can potentially explain more data. Also, in background, I come from the science background. I work as a data scientist for my day job. My PhD is in physics. So what the hell have I even doing here? I shouldn't have even been invited. What do I know? Just because the Bible is made of particles and I studied particles in physics does not make me an expert in that. But to me, it's just fascinating if this approach can work in the same way in physics. Maybe I will take some novel way of trying to explain, say, another model of dark matter to explain why galaxies have the formation rates that they do. And I could easily be wrong about that, but I'm seeing, hey, I think this model has reasons to be believed and reasons to try it out. And if I'm wrong, I'm happy to change my mind. When it comes to this sort of thing, it's probably the thing in New Testament studies that I declare that I have the least confidence in. I could easily be wrong about this, and let's just see which paradigm has the most traction.
I'd like to respond to that by saying thank you. Thank you.
Well, you're not going to say. Sorry, go ahead, Dennis.
No, it's okay.
I was just going to say, you're not going to say thank you to me, because I found that statement, when you said it, Dennis, to be very reminiscent of a lot of my experience with apologists out there. And I don't mean to be denigrating when I say that. I'm just saying that I hear a lot of thought-stopping sort of rhetoric, also thought-stopping argumentation from apologists, and I'm honestly surprised to hear you present some thought-stopping reason into this discussion. I mean, what field of study out there benefits from not questioning like the consensus? What field of study out there doesn't benefit when people of that community don't push the boundaries of what's known? Like,
John, I've never been accused of not pushing against the guilt.
No, I'm not saying that. No, I'm saying that what your statement was doing was trying to stop people from thinking about it. Like,
no, I'm not. That's not true at all, John. That really is not.
I'm sorry. That's what your statements had on me. Like, to me, that screamed, "Stop thinking about this, please stop thinking about this." That's what it said to me, Dennis. So if that's not what you meant,
I'm sorry if it
fine.
said that to you. I certainly didn't intend it.
I mean, it is worth. There is, unfortunately, in this particular area, there's rhetoric that exists that makes the subject almost toxic to touch. I mean, Ehrman earlier on was effectively calling mythicists like flat earthers or Holocaust deniers, and no one should ever have a position or anything published if they are proposing that sort of thing. That sort of rhetoric exists. It puts everyone on edge, and of course, there's plenty of, especially on Twitter, dumb mythicists. And I so much of social media, I just wish would go away and burn, and that we could try a fresh start.
Yeah, I agree.
There is.
Go ahead.
Let me just say one more thing. There is Dr. Gary Goldberg, and I did have him on my show before, and he does have an article published in the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus. He is someone else that does argue for the authenticity of the testimonium, let me on him. But in a different way from how Dr. Zinner argues it. But anyway, let's finish these super chats.
Here's the clap back from the last one. Dr. Rapper Band. Jesus never existed, and I paid more to prove we're not grifters, just realists who don't believe any Bible author stories. So That was kind of a clapback from the I fish in a tie comment. We have here.
My question for the viewer is, what does it mean to believe a Bible author's story? I believe them all, not because they happened, but I believe that they are often wonderful stories about what people understood. So I think the issue of believing Bible stories has to be reassessed in terms of what does believe mean. I don't believe any of the stories is historical.
Well, yeah, but I feel like
in the Gospels, I'm talking about that, but they are attempts to make sense out of the Jesus experience, something like that.
Well, yeah, but I feel like that kind of language and proposing that in this particular discussion is a bit of a red herring, primarily because of the fact that we're not talking about that form of belief. We're talking about what historically happened and how we can know what historically happened.
I can understand that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, I just feel like the current context of the conversation that we're having would dictate belief means believe in the historical authenticity of these things. So if you don't believe in the historical authenticity of those things, that's fine. But I mean, I feel like that's very blatant.
Okay, we're going to move on. The Messiah rides a donk. Sure, that's short for donkey. In the Latin of Galatians 4:4, factum est is used, which unlike the Greek can mean to be born, only to be made. Oh, excuse me, can't mean to be born, only to be made. Aquinas says this shows Jesus was a pre-existent whose human body was made in a woman. Anybody have any?
Well, yeah, so I would say made in a woman is adding onto it, like you're adding information into it that's not actually there. Well, that is a plausible explanation that they meant this particular kind of situation. I mean, that's possible, but I feel like adding that in there is a bit like you're inserting information into what's being said. I know that in the Greek, at least the original language that it was written in, it's the word that's used, manufacture, can be used of human births. But the problem is that it typically is used of objects that are like hand fashioned and made. So I mean, like that's the big difference there, I think.
I'll just quickly note that I think there might be too much being read into just these two Latin words for that, but I will note that in Bart Ehrman's book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, he actually notes how later scribes in Latin were using different words in the Latin to change what was there, because apparently Paul's language wasn't clear enough that this was the normal human generation kind of birth sort of thing. And they chose other Latin terms to try to fit that better. So we do know that sort of thing happened, but I would be very reluctant to use a later Latin translation to say what the Greek originally meant from what Paul meant. That seems a dubious strategy.
And just to add to it, I remember Dr. Bart Ehrman actually in one of his books, I don't know if it was Misquoting Jesus or another one, I can't remember exactly, but he cites Galatians 4:4.
It's just the one I mentioned, the Orthodox Corruption of Scripture.
Oh, okay. The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. It mentions specifically Galatians 4:4, and I want to say it was like Romans. Is it 9? It's not 9:5, is it? Or
I
Romans
think it was 1:3.
Yeah, Romans 1:3 and Galatians 4:4. There are manuscripts that are found out there where the people that copied them specifically changed the words that Paul used to be more explicit about human birth rather than just simple manufacture. So I mean, I feel like there's definitely plenty of manuscript evidence to suggest that people understood the problems that were present in the words that Paul chose to use when he described the birth of Jesus.
Sorry, guys, I had to mute myself. I heard a train coming. If you guys didn't hear that, also moving forward, we have Jennifer Silvis. I'm not watching anything with Dennis again. Dennis got checked. I don't remember you ever being this rude plus bad. Well, thank you for your input, Jennifer. I don't think Dennis was rude, and I don't ever see any winners and losers in debates. I don't think he got checked. It's a dialogue. Any comments to that, guys? If people are entitled to their opinion, and especially if there's
I hear that, Jennifer. I hear that. Thank you for your comment.
I'll also say I think I didn't disagree with Jennifer. I mean, I think I had some good arguments here with Dennis, but no checking and rudeness. Well, if you want to be rude to me, you're going to have to try harder.
Yeah, and I know that I'm a rude asshole on a good amount of occasions, so I guess I give as much as I get.
Okay, guys. We have another Ann Stevens became a YouTube member here. And we have the Dalai Lama. Our Lord and Savior DE, we witnessed your resurrection today, and we shall write gospels of your good news. I'm not sure what that means. Somebody knows? Please help me.
Maybe they meant GE for John for Godless Engineer. I don't
would
know.
think that was what it was supposed to mean.
Maybe.
The D is kind of close to the G, but still. Okay. Moving along. Caitlin, Chloe, if I'm saying it correctly, it seems like MacDonald thinks he can show up and not take things seriously because he's done this a long time, yet comes here and makes no arguments, presents no evidence, has no concern for logic. Again, she's entitled to her own opinion. I don't quite see it that way as a moderator. Dennis presents a strong hand. Anytime I've seen him operate, gentlemen, comment. People are entitled to their own opinions. I don't ever take anything to heart. I hope you guys don't either, especially Dennis.
Well, Caitlin, I think the medium, and I think my colleagues would agree with this, the medium does not encourage detailed argumentation and the discussion of criteria and so on. So I agree with you that there's so much more to say, and that we didn't say everything that we could have, and given all the detailed arguments. So I thought I gave some evidence, but and I certainly have a concern for logic, I would think. But I'm sorry it came off that way.
So, Dennis, what you're saying is you're inviting me over to your place for drinks and discussion, right?
Boy, I wish we could.
Guys, I'm moving right along. We have the Messiah rides a donk again. I mean, Paul says something of Jesus's birth using, and I can't read that in Greek, but there are better explanations than space. Josephus. Christians don't typically say Jesus was the Messiah. Rather, he is the Messiah. Christians don't typically say Jesus was the Messiah. They say he is the Messiah. Okay. I can't pronounce that Greek word. What is that, Jacob? Do you know? Can you help?
Oh, this is genomenon from genomai.
Okay.
This is part of the terminology that John was bringing up about what language Paul is using. Is it using the terms for manufacturing versus birth? There's also some other ambiguity because that word can also mean for normal human birth. I remember I tried to keep my Greek somewhere in the vicinity of not being total rust. So when I was going through the text that you're supposed to read as a Greek student, Xenophon's Anabasis, literally the fourth word in that text is about the birth of one of the Persian king's kids and using that particular word. So it's clearly usable for that. And if you get it literally in your school books, it will have that meaning. The argument more is, why is Paul avoiding the even more clear word for general birth and using this one that has the greater possible valences? To give a sense of what that valence is, let's imagine I go in the kitchen and my wife is there and I say, let's make a cake. Seems totally reasonable. If I then say, let's make a baby, I'm using the exact same verb, but the context completely changes what the activity is and what's being generated, and how. So context, that's pretty much this entire debate.
Okay. Moving along. Thomas B. The big problem for TF. Origins doesn't use the content of TF in Contra Celsum. He says the opposite, that Josephus did not believe Jesus was the Messiah.
Yeah, he does say that. Oregon does not mention. He never mentions the testimonium at all. He refers to the James passage.
Yep, that's right.
Or if you go with the stance that it's an interpolation. I don't go there, but if you say it's an interpolation, then I guess he's getting something mixed up. But he seems to be referring to the James passage one way or the other.
On that, because you brought that up, there does seem to be some mix-up on the part of Origen, because he says things that are explicitly not in the Josephus passage, even if we leave it as is, because it calls him James the Just. That title is not used by Josephus, and Josephus doesn't at all associate the death of James with the destruction of the temple. That is something Origen says, Josephus says, but that's not true. Conversely, there is a source that does say those things, that calls him James the Just or James the Righteous, and associates his death with then the coming army of Vespasian and Titus and the destruction of the temple, and that's Hegesippus in the later 2nd century.
Okay. Fish in a tie. We have ossuaries dated pre-70 inscribed: Jesus Messiah, Jesus Savior, Jesus ascends, Jesus Son of God, Jesus branch of David. This ends mythicism.
I'm gonna respond to this. Is the reason I purposefully did not bring this up in debates. I'm probably not going to in the future either. On a topic like this is because the claims made about all of that are extremely controversial, and there's a lot of rejection going on there. And I guess even if one would incorporate that and say that, okay, this is a Jesus that lived, well, obviously these are ossuaries of real people, someone could make the argument that none of them refer to the biblical Jesus. And so to me, it's a bit of a mess and would kind of perhaps derail the discussion.
It's good often.
Yeah. I'm also honestly confused. Are we saying there are 5 different ossuaries that mention Jesus? Was Jesus so large they had to put his bones in 5 boxes? I am really confused by this claim, and I have high doubts of its accuracy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say that how would you know specifically that any of these ossuaries are actually representative of somebody that that started Christianity? I just don't know what the criteria would be, for distinguishing which one was the true, bone box of Jesus who started Christianity.
We have the Mythic Life. Thanks to Dr. Adair for mentioning the Esoterica channel. Made people check into Merkaba mysticism's chariot literature, possible influence on Paul. Did you mention that?
Yeah, I did in an earlier statement from Mythic Life. And yeah, so definitely agree, Esoterica channel, great. And that there's some connection between that literature and Paul is at least possible, though it's worth noting, I think all the Merkaba literature is significantly later. So either it existed in some form and Paul's along with it, or it later develops, but Paul is in that stream of thought that doesn't really concretize until much later.
That's right.
I don't know enough to say.
Okay, we got here. Why does Pliny the Younger not have knowledge of Christianity prior to his governorship?
I don't think that's really relevant. I mean, that doesn't prove he did or didn't exist. I don't get it.
Kind of running through these now, guys. Let's see. We've got a few more. Fish in a tie again. Dr. MacDonald, the Mythicists are sore losers. You won. Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm not trying to get like aggravated on Dr. MacDonald's behalf, but at least in the show title, your name is spelled different. So I don't know. Like I don't know.
Yeah, he misspelled
Matt.
the A. There should
Oh.
be an A between the M and C. That's correct.
And Fish and a Tie, if you really want to make me sore, I dare you, donate $5 more.
Right.
Let me just comment. I think scholarly debates are not about winning and losing. They're about learning. And so I think that you as auditors or viewers have won. You're the ones who have been exposed to scholars who have been thinking about these things and differ with them. So I don't know what it means to win apart from listening in and making your own judgments about what you've heard.
That's it. I always say there's no winners or losers in debates. I always say that, but yeah, we have Jennifer Silvas again. Thank you, Dennis. I saw you soften. Appreciate. Not sure the check bit. Your homework woke me up. So she came back with another comment.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah,
From the one
thank you.
earlier. We have one more here. Mr. Warlight, in each of y'all's opinion, what significance does Joshua ben Jehoshaphat, if I'm pronouncing it correct, from Zechariah chapter 6 have in relation to Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels?
Well, I'll comment real quick and by saying I don't have a problem at all. Like I think it's more of an obvious. Doesn't matter if one thinks Jesus existed or not. There is clearly Old Testament rewrites into the Jesus story. One of the most obvious is the massacre of the innocents. That is so clearly based on the massacre of the innocent story we see from the Moses story in the book of Exodus. So there are clear rewrites going on, parallels being set up between the New Testament Jesus and Old Testament figures. So, I mean, as for Joshua ben Jehoshaphat,
Jehoshaphat.
yeah, thank you. I'm not fully prepared to discuss that beyond what I just said.
I'll just say that if the mythicist model is true, this was almost certainly one of the verses used or mined, along with much else of Zechariah, for creating their narrative of the Jesus figure they have. But again, we can argue it on either historicity or mythicism, so it doesn't really move the needle one direction or the other.
Yeah, and I'll say that this particular figure in Judaism probably has more of an effect on Philo's logos, as far as directly as we can tell. But I think that it was definitely, it seems like it was used in order to, manifest different ideas or aspects about the Christian version of Christ.
Well, guys, like I was going to say, that's the end of the super chat questions. If you guys have any more closing statements to make, feel free to do so. We're at about the 2 hour and 18-minute mark. I'm seeing it correct.
Yeah,
Sean,
that's
I'd like
correct.
to say something if I could.
Mm-hmm.
I want to tell you what the historical Jesus personally means to me as an atheist and why this issue is important to me. Because I think he needs to be understood not as the Christian Christ, but as a Jewish reformer who was trying to make Jewish law compatible with people who were marginal. And in the Q document, as I've reconstructed it, the only thing you need to obey in the Jewish law is the double love command to love your God and your neighbor as yourself. If you do that, you're included in the kingdom of God in a way that would not be true for the nomikoi, the Torah enforcers. So I think we're involved in the historical Jesus quest, in the quest for a radical Jewish reformer. And I must say, 2 weeks out, we're going to have an American experience politically in which I worry about people who are marginal. And so I'm not trying to glorify the historical Jesus as the Christian Christ. I'm trying to understand him as a radical Jewish reformer who exemplifies some of the values that I confess to hold myself.
We do have a couple more super chats, Sean. Why don't we take them real quick before we close?
Wait, hold on.
Just 3 more.
Okay, I see him right here.
Yeah.
From Caitlin Chloe. If MacDonald thinks scholarly debates are about learning, why do you choose to only present what you call fiction? If MacDonald thinks scholarly debates are about learning, why did you choose to only present what you call fiction? I don't think he called it fiction. Yeah, I don't really hear him say that.
Yes, he did.
I believe he did.
Did he? Okay.
I was interpreting the question, if I may reinterpret. I think she's asking, why is it that MacDonald is trying to teach us about the historical Jesus by things that he himself says are fictional, including the reconstructed Q, that it's still in some form fan fiction.
Sure. Okay.
I see. Well, I just think that because we find evidence on the other side of the fiction of the origin of that fiction in a historical person, that's all.
Okay. And I mean, I just would have difficulty being able to distinguish between the fiction and the history if we don't have like anything to like actually denote like the difference between the two. Like I don't see anything that says that it's just not all fiction. So that's my hang up.
Okay. We have Jennifer again. LOL, get mad.
But I think Jennifer was talking about the fish and a tie guy.
She could be. When I was looking at her previous statement to Dennis, and then we have a fish and a tie again.
It was I think it was to Aaron actually, because
about being insulted or being treated rudely.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you want to actually get me upset, then lie to me, because that triggers me real fast. But fortunately, nothing like that happened. I didn't expect that to happen. So, like I say, if you want me to be mad, that's the way to do it.
Another one
there's
from
just
my
one
fish
more.
and
Get this.
Yep.
Yes.
Are none of you familiar with Dominus Flevet in the Jewish Christian tombs at Mount of Offense and Sukenik tomb? That's what I was referring to, not the Taupi tomb. Okay, so that's going back to the comments about the ossuaries.
I don't think that's relevant here.
It would link more with this here.
My answer that I said, the answer from me is the same as earlier. I just don't think it's the same. I just don't think it's very relevant here in this debate.
Gotcha.
I just don't.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll say that it doesn't matter what tomb you're talking about because there's still the question of how do we know that that's actually the tomb, right? So I mean, of the actual Jesus that like started everything. I mean, I think that you would need to like, substantiate that.
Right. Gentlemen, any final words? Comments?
I don't have any of it. So I've said all I had to say.
Good once again. Thanks for having me as a moderator again, Jacob.
John, did you want to say anything?
No, I mean, I thought today's debate was pretty good. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope
Likewise.
that everybody had a good day today.
Yeah. Same here.
And I'll try to take the last closing. Obviously, we were not expecting to change everyone's minds. I'm pretty sure, again, Dennis and I would have to have at least a few drinks together before he would lose enough brain cells to start thinking that I'm correct. But I am glad that we had the conversation, that we were able to make some progress in how to have it. Though I do think my concerns of how a historical model can fit and explain all the data is still not there, though if Historicity can do it, that will be an improvement for the field, and I welcome it. If the issues I brought up can actually be resolved, that's progress in the field, and I'm for it. But I will also note that the worry that Dennis has coming in a couple weeks, I do share that same worry, but I don't think the historical Jesus is the solution to it, even if there was one, because the people coming in a couple weeks are going to be using the cross of Christian nationalism to beat over the heads of the marginalized. And ultimately, whether or not there was historical Jesus, it's lost in our political debate. And
I agree with you.
yeah,
No,
I
agree.
think it was John Dominic Crossan that has said that, like, in Jesus studies, people do autobiography and call it biography to create their Jesus, and I fear we might fall into that same trap if we
I fear that. I fear
extract
that
that.
too. If I might just say one thing, we've talked a lot about the Testimonium Flavianum. I just want to make two observations. One is a historical observation, and the other is a promise. The historical observation is that many scholars hold that Luke knew Josephus's Antiquities. If he did, and he knew about John the Baptist, and he knew about James, Jesus's brother, apparently, he surely would have known before the Christian interpolation what Josephus said about Jesus. And in the book that I mentioned to you before, Feuding Gospel Authors, I argue that Luke rewrote Jesus's passion to declare Jesus innocent of all charges by Romans, and also in the Acts of the Apostles that Paul is a Torah observant and temple observing character. So I think Luke is trying to correct the Testimonium Flavianum. But of course, that takes us into a different debate, and we don't have time for that. But I think it's fascinating to ask whether Luke and in his gospel and the Acts of the Apostles is trying to correct what he saw in the Testimonium Flavianum. But that's for another day.
And I won't respond to that because we are so low on time, but I do want to just say one last thing is, while I am not professionally trained in this area, it's also a place that I have been actually trying to put out publishable material to actually advance this project. And I think in my own efforts, I am trying to actually show what we can do with the Mythicist model to move New Testament studies forward. So, Dennis, I'm happy to share some of the stuff that's going to be published in the near future and the stuff I'm currently working on. I actually shared with you what I presented at SBL this last time. And it's part of the research program I have going. And I want to say that there is at least a paradigm that we can make progress on. And your work is a part of that as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Sean, you did a good job. Thank you, buddy.
Thanks again.
I second that.
I'm definitely Jacob's right hand man. I can't see that well anymore, though. You guys got to excuse me. When I'm reading, it's like I don't have my monitor. I'm looking at the computer and I'm like squinting with the reading glasses on, mind you. So it's a little difficult at my age. People think I'm a lot younger than what I am, but I'm really not, to be honest with you. So I still enjoy coming on and helping out as much as I possibly can. Thanks for having me again, Jacob.
Yeah, thank you for moderating.
Definitely.
And I thank you, Aaron, and Dennis, and John for the debate. This was wonderful. I enjoyed it very much.
Same here.
Happy New Year, everybody.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.